does it seem to you like our lives are pawns in a game of politics? It sure seems that way to me, especially when you get gas, when you pay bills, when you buy things at the grocery store, inflation, high interest rates, increasingly draconian rules in our social contract with our government. That is the theme of Carol Roth's new book, You Will Own Nothing, because she says this is intentional because all of this hands power to global elites. She has a lot to say on all of this, and she joins us to ring in. Thank you so much for joining us.
Always great to be with you, Natalie.
So I finished the book last week. Now I'm a fan of your books, having read two. Your first book, The War on Small Business,
actually,
I cannot recommend.
Second book.
Oh, okay. First book that I read. Sorry. I guess I have to catch up. Okay. I'm one behind. The War on Small Business, I thought, made an amazing case for how the government chose winners and losers during the pandemic, not based on science. One of the major cases you make in your book is that if you own nothing, they own you. Can you explain this? Because I think it's something we all should sort of crochet on a pillow and remind ourselves all the time so that we don't eventually live in the Hunger Games.
Sure. So, for people who aren't familiar with my background, I am a recovering investment banker. I've been commentating on markets for a very long time. I've been advocating for wealth creation opportunities for more than a quarter of a century. And so there's one thing I know above all else is that if you want to create wealth, you have to have ownership. Wealth comes from owning assets in particular that can store value or hopefully appreciate in value. That is how you gain wealth. It's not just from working, it's making sure that you have this ownership. And you can go throughout history, and while they tell you might be quote unquote happy if you don't own anything, we can see that throughout history, the people who don't have ownership have been very unfree. They have been very unhappy. In many cases, they have starved to death or lost their lives. And so being able to have property and not only the wealth creation opportunities that come with it, but the sovereignty. If you own your house, you can do whatever you want to do, within legal limits. Obviously, can't infringe on other people's rights, but within those parameters within your house. If you are renting from a corporate landlord, they get to dictate the terms by which you get to live. And the same goes on and on. If you don't have access to a car, you don't have that level of freedom. You are dependent on other people for your freedoms. And so it really, is a mechanism to have ownership of you if you don't have the freedom and that personal sovereignty.
Now, you have a whole chapter against C.B.D.Cs, or central bank digital currencies. You really emphasize owning real things, for instance, precious metals, because those have stood the test of time, things that you can trade for real things. And so this idea of central bank digital currency, what are some of the reasons you don't like it? And then you say we don't need it.
Yeah, so obviously having your wealth in a form factor that you can control, I think is very important for people to be thinking about, as we have seen the incredible manipulations that have gone on with currency, with the economy, and with sort of everything else in our lives. For people who aren't familiar with a central bank digital currency, that is a currency in a digital format that is issued by a central bank and or its corresponding government. And the unique factor of it is that it is fully centralized and completely transparent to them. And because it's digital, it has features like programmability and the ability to expire should the people who are putting it out into the world decide they want to do that. So it's not that the central banks don't have any control over our money. It's not that governments don't have any control over our money, because unfortunately they do. And the more that you leave it, in that fiat currency that they control, the more subject you are to that level of control. But the concept of a central bank digital currency, that they can see every single transaction, down to the dollar level, that digital dollar level, is absolutely frightening, because whether it's under the guise of, hey, we need to control inflation, so instead of enacting monetary policy to change interest rates and the like, we're just going to shut off access to people's money. That could be one way that goes about. Another one is, well, we think that cows are bad for the environment, and so we're trying to be more green, and you've had too many burgers this month, so I'm sorry, Carol, you can't have that burger that you're trying to buy at McDonald's or whatever it is. And then even worse, as we've seen, the policing of speech on social platforms and the deplatforming of people across the world. Maybe we're having this conversation, Natalie, they don't like what we're talking about. So, on a respective basis, the central banks and governments behind those digital currencies say, sorry, guys, you can't have access to that. And so that really does give up your freedom if you are not able to transact, if you're not able to have a store of wealth and value and your ability to access what you have earned. This is money that you have gone out, put out your blood, sweat, and tears, or taken on a risk to earn. And they are now going to come into the middle of that and say, no, we're going to control that next level of how you exchange and how you gain wealth. I mean, that would be the absolute, the ultimate in financial tyranny and the absolute end of freedom. And so it's not one of those things that's hypothetical. I mean, that's what people need to understand.
No, we saw it in Canada during the trucker convoy. Yeah, we don't like what you're doing, so we're taking your bank account.
And more than that, just in terms of the C.B.D.C itself, they've run pilot programs. The G7 put out their principles for retail-facing C.B.D.Cs. These aren't actions that you take on something that isn't being seriously considered, which is why we need to raise that red flag now and make sure that people stand up and do everything they can to prevent it if it's put in place, to not use it and not to be lured into the system, because they're going to put out that carrot to try to get people to convert over.
Right. Now, one of the things that you say is a big problem with the U.S. government is their inability to be a responsible host, I guess, of global currency, and that economists warned about this with what's called the Triffin dilemma. That's fascinating because maybe it shows how hard it would have been for any country. We don't have to feel so bad because this dilemma exists, right? It was always going to exist. France might have done the same thing. So can you explain how hard it is for the United States to both be looking out for the world and ourselves, how it's almost impossible, and where it's leading us?
Well, so there are a couple things that are true. One is that holding the global reserve currency is not something that has happened on a forever basis. The United States has been in that position for about 80 years, but before the United States, it was the British, and before the British, it was the Dutch. So this is something that changes due to historical cycles, geopolitical cycles, but usually because the cycle within a country gets to the point where that particular country takes on too much debt, allows their military to deteriorate, has infighting, and does all those things that implodes from the inside versus the outside. The Triffin dilemma comes from Robert Triffin, who is a noted economist. And as you said, the conflict when you have the global reserve currency is that you have that as your country's currency, but everybody else is using it. So you're trying to keep, in our case, the US dollar stable for the domestic economy in the world. Now, you want to give them a pass and say, oh, that's very difficult. So, maybe they're slogging through. But the dilemma is one versus the other. What the Fed and the U.S. government has done is neither. They have not kept the U.S. dollar stable for the domestic economy. In the terms of the U.S. dollar does not buy the same thing at the grocery store that it did a couple of years ago, or 40 years ago, or go back in time. So they haven't done a good job in maintaining that stability domestically, and they also have not done a good job of doing that on the international stage. So instead of favoring one over the other, they have amazingly managed to do neither, and I think that is where we can ding them as being, derelict in terms of their duty to maintain the stability of the currency. And I mean, you can see in terms of having 15 years of massive central bank interference in the markets, 9 years of zero interest rate policy, and the delta, making up very close to zero interest rate policy. I mean, that's just absolutely obscene. In the US, our public debt to GDP is around 120% right now. That's an emerging market balance sheet backed by the world's reserve currency that has kept us from having a traditional currency crisis. So, I think it's very easy for them to be criticized for absolutely mismanaging and stepping away from their responsibilities and just doing a huge horrible job that's transferred wealth from Main Street to Wall Street. Even though we know it's a difficult thing for them to do what they need to do, they still have managed to mess up the cornerstone of what they could control.
Okay, so they get an F on both accounts, and
unfortunately,
yes, okay, I don't feel better about that dilemma.
Unfortunately, we do on the other side of it. We get an F because they get an F.
Right. I mean, your entire bit about Social Security as a Ponzi scheme is interesting because that's how it's going to affect us, because our leaders are borrowing from us, basically, in a way that is not protected. We don't know if we're ever going to see that again. I think it's really fascinating, your chapter about student loans. You say that this is a ploy to keep young people from building wealth from the get-go and be stuck with a lifetime of debt. Can you speak to this and explain how this is a common lie, that we all accept that all education is good and worth it, and the more the better, and how this keeps young people from building wealth in a way that no previous generation has had?
Yes, so the way that we look at education is very strange. So in many respects, education is priceless, and you should be a lifelong learner, and you should strive to continue to educate yourself. And it does, when you make the investment in yourself, have a payoff depending on what you pay for it. In the United States in particular, what college has become is not necessarily about education, it's become about accreditation. And the reason people are going is not to be well-rounded in the classics and to be a person of the world. They are going because they think it's going to translate into more money and a more successful career for them. So that is an investment. And if you're going to make an investment, people should know that investments are not valuable at any price. If you overpay for the investment, you're never going to get a return on it. You may get a negative return. You could end up going bankrupt and the like. And so the same thing goes, with the education system. And what we've had happen in the United States is absolutely disgusting. We have had the U.S. government nationalize a large part of the student lending business, and they have become the largest predatory lender in the country. They are transferring wealth from teenagers in many cases and very young people to colleges and their administrators. And they're doing this because there is no underwriting process. There is no differentiation based on what kind of education you're getting. And on the back end, because there's no underwriting, there is no bankruptcy process. So basically, young people who don't have the tools, which again is shameful since we have government-run education, but they don't have the tools today to evaluate a return on investment in terms of what they're making with the education, are saddled with 5, in some cases 6-figure loans that are never going to pay off for many of them for the kinds of degrees they're getting. There are certainly exceptions to the rule. Maybe if you go into high finance or engineering or whatnot, certain high earning careers, and also depending on where you go. If you're going to an Ivy League school versus a state school, or if you're going to maybe a smaller school where you're not taking on as much money, there are some variations. But what we've seen overall is that college has grown, I think it's 5 times the GDP and 8 times wages in terms of their cost to their outcome. So it's not like we can make the argument that, the increased cost of college, that's returning more money in terms of the GDP, or it's boosting wages. It's not. It's far outpacing that, far outpacing inflation. It's just been a wholesale wealth transfer. And the idea that you go to some mediocre school and for 4 years it costs $320,000 and you're going to get a $60,000 job at the end of that math doesn't make sense in any universe. So we have a huge problem that needs to be undone and readdressed, because when you then have that coming out into the workforce, your balance sheet is wrecked. How are you going to be able to buy a house and start a life and do those things to make sure that you do have that ownership? And that was, by the way, the whole purpose of you going to college to begin with.
Right. Yeah, you had this shocking statistic about how college has become so much more expensive, but they're not investing in professors.
No.
They're investing in administrators that are
Correct.
doing things like diversity programs. So that's what kids are paying more for, not necessarily a better education. There are so many other great chapters in Carol's book. For instance, you take the piss out of ESGs. We've done that on the show too. A lot of context about devaluing the US dollar. And yet this is not a partisan book. It's not one party's fault over the other. This is for all of us to get involved and solve. So I highly recommend the book. I want to say thank you for joining us to talk about it, and come back another time because it seems like our economy is not going to get better unless we all do something together.
Thank you. No, I appreciate it. And we have to empower ourselves with the knowledge, because the elite may want you to own nothing, but I want you to own everything, Natalie. So we have to turn this around.
Great. All right. We sure will. One YouTube channel at a time.
That's right.
All right. Thanks again.
All right. Thanks. Have a great one.